There are places in this world that don't just exist, they hunger. Have you ever heard of a room so sinister that it doesn't just trap you? It consumes you? Some rooms are abandoned for a reason, forgotten, sealed away, left to be erased by time. But this one, it waits. It lures people in with its silence, its emptiness, and then it takes them. No one knows where they go, no bodies are ever found, just a lingering sense that something was there, watching, waiting, feeding. Some say it's just a myth, a trick of the mind. But those who have stepped inside were never seen again. And the worst part? The room isn't always in the same place. It appears where you least expect it, behind a door you don't remember closing, in a house that was supposed to be safe. And once you know about it, it might already be looking for you. Jonathan had recently rented the house. A quiet place, low rent, the perfect fresh start. The landlord had given him a strange smile while handing over the keys, as if holding something back. "This room hasn't been used much. Most people don't stay long," he had said casually. Jonathan shrugged it off. But on the first night, as he stepped inside, a strange unease settled over him. The air was heavy, stale, carrying the scent of something long forgotten. Cracks snaked along the walls, deep and jagged, as if hiding secrets. But the most unsettling part? The moment he shut the door, just for a second, it felt like the room breathed. What happens next will leave you questioning reality. So watch the video till the end. Welcome to Veils of Night. The room felt suffocating the moment he stepped inside. The dim light flickered above, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to creep along the walls as if alive. The wallpaper, once white, had faded to a sickly yellow and was peeling at the edges, revealing cracked, damp plaster beneath. The air was thick with the smell of mold, mixed with something sharp, almost metallic, like something had been left to rot for years. Every breath felt heavy, as though the room itself was absorbing the very air he breathed. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and an eerie silence hung in the space, broken only by the distant ticking of an old, rusted clock on the wall, its hands frozen at midnight. In the corner, an old chair sat facing the door, its worn fabric faded and torn, as if someone or something had been sitting there for an eternity. He could almost feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. The room felt alive, as though it wasn't just a space, but a presence. Quiet, yet powerful. Every inch of the room seemed to hum with an unseen energy, as if it was aware of his every movement. The walls, with their peeling wallpaper and damp cracks, seemed to whisper in the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur that made his skin crawl. The air was thick, stifling, pressing in on him from all sides, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the chill that hung in the room, it was the feeling of being watched. The very atmosphere felt heavy, as if something unseen, something ancient, was observing him with intent. The faint creak of the floorboards under his feet seemed to echo louder than it should, as though the room was responding, reacting to his presence. It was waiting, patient, its intentions unclear but menacing. There was no escape from the suffocating sensation that the room wasn't just a place to inhabit. It was a predator, and he was its prey. The room was alive with subtle, unsettling noises that gnawed at his nerves. There was the faint scratching sound from somewhere behind the walls, as though something, or someone, was slowly trying to claw its way out. It was soft at first, almost dismissible, but it grew louder with each passing minute, as though it was getting closer. The floorboards creaked under his weight, the sound too loud for a house that had been so still. It was as if the very foundation of the house was groaning, shifting with an unsettling sense of discomfort. Here and there, he thought he heard faint whispers, too soft to make out, but unmistakably there, like voices from another time or from places hidden deep within the walls. Every sound seemed to amplify the oppressive silence that filled the air, making him feel like he was no longer alone, as though the house itself was breathing, waiting, and watching. As the days passed, small, unsettling things began to happen. Things that couldn't easily be explained. At first, it was just the lights flickering, a soft, almost imperceptible stutter in the overhead bulb. But soon it became more frequent, almost rhythmic, as if the light itself was struggling to stay on, flickering in time with his heartbeat. One evening, he returned to the room to find objects subtly moved, out of place in ways that didn't make sense. A book that had been left on the shelf was now on the floor, its pages bent and torn. The chair in the corner, which he had never touched, was slightly turned facing him, just enough to make it impossible to ignore. And then, the shadows. They began to appear in the corners of the room, deep and unnatural, shifting when he wasn't looking. At first, they seemed harmless, like tricks of the light, but as the shadows grew longer, they felt more sinister, as if something was watching him from the edges of the room, waiting for the perfect moment to move. The unease grew with each passing night. Little things, almost too small to notice, started to pile up, each one adding to the sense that something was horribly wrong. The door, for instance, wouldn't close all the way. No matter how hard he pushed it, there was always a small crack left, a sliver of darkness on the other side that seemed to watch him. He'd try again and again, but the door resisted, as if it had a mind of its own. Then there was the chair. It was always in the same spot in the corner, but somehow it always seemed to be facing him, no matter how he tried to move it. Each time he returned to the room, it was slightly turned toward him, its empty seat staring back like an unwelcome guest. He couldn't recall ever moving it himself, yet there it was, as though it had a life of its own, watching him in a way that sent chills crawling up his spine. Each little detail, each subtle shift, made him feel more and more trapped, as if the room itself was adjusting to his presence, aware of him in ways he couldn't comprehend. With each passing day, the feeling grew stronger, a cold, gnawing sensation that burrowed deeper into his chest. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something darker, more suffocating. It was as if the room itself was alive, feeding off his unease, growing stronger with every moment he spent within its walls. The air felt heavier, thicker, making it harder to breathe, as though the room was tightening around him, pushing in on him with invisible hands. At night, the shadows seemed to stretch further, creeping into every corner, and the whispers, they were no longer faint. They had become clearer, sharper, like the low murmurs of voices he couldn't place. Voices that seemed to know his name, his deepest thoughts, his most hidden fears. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the light, every subtle movement in the room felt deliberate, as if the house itself was toying with him, growing more aware of his every breath. The feeling of being watched intensified until it was overwhelming, a presence that never left him. And then it hit him. The room wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a dark, insidious force that was feeding on his terror, growing more powerful, more malevolent with each passing second. The situation escalated with terrifying speed. The room, once dimly lit, seemed to grow darker by the hour, as though the very walls were swallowing the light. The air itself felt thicker, almost suffocating, pressing against him like the weight of 1,000 unseen hands. Every breath became a struggle, as if the room was trying to choke him, to steal his very breath away. The shadows deepened, stretching out further into the corners, twisting in unnatural shapes that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The temperature dropped, and with it, an overwhelming sense of dread filled the space. It was as though the room was growing, expanding around him, its darkness consuming everything it touched. The more he tried to fight it, the more the room seemed to tighten its grip, as if it were alive, determined to trap him within its suffocating embrace. The sense of being watched was no longer subtle. It was all-encompassing, suffocating him, filling his every thought with terror, until he could no longer tell if it was the room itself or something far worse that was closing in on him. The longer he stayed in the room, the weaker he became. It was subtle at first, just a slight heaviness in his limbs, a faint dizziness that seemed to come and go. But soon, it grew harder to stand, as though the very air around him was sapping his strength. His muscles ached, his body felt like it was made of lead, and every step felt like wading through thick mud. His head grew foggy, his vision blurred at the edges, as if the room itself was clouding his mind, draining him bit by bit. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was deeper, almost spiritual, like something inside him was being slowly siphoned away, his energy leaving him with every passing second. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and with each breath, the air grew thicker, more oppressive. It was as if the room was feeding off him, slowly devouring his vitality, leaving him hollow and weak, as though his very essence was being consumed. He tried to move, to escape, but his body refused to cooperate, his legs trembling with every step, as if they no longer had the strength to carry him. The room wasn't just draining his energy, it was breaking him piece by piece. As the room tightened its grip on him, strange and horrifying things began to unfold. He started to see fleeting glimpses, flickers of movement in the corners of his vision, images of terrified faces twisted in pain and fear, their eyes wide in eternal terror. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, the stress and fear warping his perception. But the more he looked, the clearer they became. These faces weren't just illusions. They were real. They were alive, in the very fabric of the room. He saw their expressions, agony, pleading, as if they were trapped within the walls, unable to escape. The air seemed to hum with their presence, a low, guttural sound that almost felt like a distant scream, muffled yet unmistakable, vibrating through the walls. It was as though their suffering had left a permanent mark on the room, a kind of twisted echo that reverberated through the air. Occasionally, he could hear faint, bone-chilling noises from within the walls, scratching, thumping, and the unmistakable sound of something being dragged, like bodies shifting in their graves. The room was no longer just a space. It was a prison, a place that had absorbed the suffering of its past victims, and now it was trying to show him what had happened before him, urging him to understand the true horror of what lay beneath the surface. As the days blurred into one another, the truth became inescapable. The room, with its oppressive weight and creeping darkness, wasn't just a place. It was something far more sinister. He began to piece together the fragments of the room's history, whispered through the haunting echoes and glimpses of the past victims' faces. This house had always been cursed, built on ancient land where dark rituals had once taken place. The walls weren't just walls. They were a prison, a gateway to something far older, far darker, something that had been bound here for centuries, feeding on the fear and pain of those unfortunate enough to enter. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The room wasn't just trapping him, it was consuming him. He could feel it now in every fiber of his being. His limbs grew heavy, as if they were no longer his own. His legs felt as though they were sinking into the floor, being pulled deeper with every step he took. The air grew thicker, suffocating him, as though the very walls were inching closer, closing in on him, intent on swallowing him whole. His arms felt like they were being drawn toward the walls, the cold surface seeping into his skin, creeping up his body, as if the house itself was hungry, pulling him toward it to devour him. Panic surged through him, but it was no use. His movements grew slower, more sluggish, as if the room had a hold on him, dragging him closer to its insidious core. The horrifying truth was undeniable. He wasn't just trapped by the room. He was being devoured by it, his essence slowly being siphoned away, piece by piece, until nothing remained but an empty shell. The room wasn't satisfied with just trapping souls. It needed them, fed on them, and now it was taking everything from him. In a frenzy, he scrambled toward the door, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard he pulled, it felt as though the door itself was locked by some invisible force, a barrier that wouldn't let him escape. His breath quickened, panic surging through him as he turned, desperately searching for another way out. The window he hadn't noticed before, but now he ran toward it, hands clawing at the edges of the frame. It was sealed shut, the glass cold and unyielding, no matter how much he banged against it. He pressed his forehead against the glass, the desperation consuming him as he stared out, hoping to see the world beyond. But it was as if the outside didn't exist anymore. A heavy silence filled the room, suffocating him as the walls seemed to shift. He could feel it now. The room wasn't just trapping him, it was tightening its grip, closing in around him. The walls inched forward, not with the slow, deliberate pace of a structure, but with the unnatural, terrifying speed of something alive. It was as if the room itself was closing in on him, determined to crush him, to swallow him whole. He turned in every direction, each wall now pressing against him like a vice, each breath more labored than the last. His feet felt glued to the floor, his body trembling with the overwhelming realization that no matter how hard he fought, there was no way out. Every escape attempt was futile. The room was not going to let him leave. It was winning and he was powerless, a mere puppet in its unforgiving, suffocating grip. In his panic, he tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came from his mouth. His throat constricted, but the words never left his lips. It was as if the very air had stolen his voice, leaving him silent in his desperate struggle. He opened his mouth again, a scream building in his chest, but still nothing. The room, once full of oppressive silence, now seemed to mock him with its unyielding quiet. Just as his terror reached its peak, he thought he saw a figure outside the door, someone perhaps who could help. His heart leapt with a glimmer of hope. He rushed toward the door, pounding his fists against it, begging for someone to hear him, to let him out. The figure outside, a shadowy silhouette, seemed to acknowledge his presence, and with a surge of relief, he saw the door slowly creak open. But as he stepped forward, reaching out for the person, the figure vanished in an instant, without a trace. The door slammed shut on its own as though it had never opened, and all that was left was the haunting emptiness of the room. He spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief, searching the corners, the walls, but there was no sign of the person who had been there just moments ago. It was as if they had never existed at all. His stomach churned with horror as the room seemed to swallow the memory of their presence, leaving only the crushing isolation of his own voiceless screams. Desperation clawed at him, but no help was coming. Not only was the room alive, but it had begun to twist reality itself, making escape seem impossible, and the very hope of rescue vanish like a cruel illusion. As the seconds stretched into eternity, the room seemed to settle, its hunger momentarily satisfied. The silence was deafening, and for a brief moment, it almost felt like everything had returned to normal. But the tension lingered. The air was thick, as if the very space around him had absorbed every shred of his fear, every ounce of his struggle. The oppressive weight of the room hung in the air, unyielding and cold. With no way to escape, no help in sight, and the desperate scream still lodged in his throat, the man's body grew weaker, his movements sluggish, as though the room had finally drained him of everything he once was. His eyes fluttered shut, and his body slumped to the floor, the once strong man now a hollow shell, consumed by the very room that had trapped him. The camera's gaze lingered on the now still figure, lying motionless in the center of the room. But as the scene fades to black, an unsettling thought creeps in. The shadows in the corners of the room seem to flicker, like a faint, unseen movement. It's almost as if the room is waiting for its next victim, hungry for more, ever eager to claim those who dare enter its grasp. The question remains, how many others has it taken over the years? And how many more will it devour in silence, leaving only echoes of the lost souls that once walked its cursed halls? The room had claimed another, but its hunger is far from satisfied. The room waits, always hungry for the next one to wander in, never to be seen again. Its hunger is unrelenting, its grasp eternal, and those who dare enter will never escape. Would you dare step foot into a room like this, knowing the danger that lurks within? Or do you think it's best to leave certain places untouched, their dark secrets best left undisturbed? If you enjoyed this terrifying tale, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with those brave enough to hear it, and subscribe to Veils of Night for more spine-chilling stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next, if you dare.